Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a role that, whether you work in an office, run a community group, or even manage a large corporation, you actually perform more often than anything else: followership. Decades ago, scholars like Kelly pointed out the simple truth. Most of us spend far, far more time carrying out the follower role than we do, occupying a positional leadership spot.
Yeah, it's absolutely fundamental. It's the engine room of any successful organization, really. Yet, paradoxically, it's always leadership that seems to get all the attention, all the spotlight.
Exactly. And okay, while the literature on followership is definitely growing, um, our sources present this fascinating paradox right from the start. Is the concept of follower truly legitimate? Or is it, like some critics claim, just organizational fiction?
Hmm.
So our mission today is to really get into the material that argues for the necessity of this field, tackle that huge challenge of follower self-identity, and maybe suggest a much-needed refresh on how we approach this really fundamental human role.
And what's truly fascinating here, or maybe concerning, is the almost hostile opposition from some corners. You have critics flatly claiming the term follower is a fiction. Why? Because people simply refuse to identify with the label. They actually call it an absent identity.
Wow, okay. So people do the role, they take instructions, they execute strategy, they support the leader, but they fundamentally refuse to claim the label for themselves. That's the core problem then.
That's exactly. And this absence of identity, they argue, it kind of mirrors the problem with traditional leadership models too. They point out that popular ideas like, the heroic transformational leader, they set these fundamentally unrealistic standards.
Right, the leader on the white horse sort of thing.
Precisely. Leaders are constantly striving to meet these lofty, heroic ideals that, let's be honest, they inevitably fail to attain. So if leadership is already seen as unrealistic, they argue followership is even worse because, well, who wants to wear that negative label?
And the consequence of all this criticism is that some people are basically suggesting, well, let's just stop exploring followership altogether. Maybe just focus on fixing the broken heroic leadership model instead. But that feels like ignoring like half the equation, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. You can't understand the whole picture by only looking at one side. We have to understand why the term itself feels so poisonous to people, and the sources really suggest it boils down to an insufficiency of language.
Yeah.
The words we use just don't cut it.
Yeah, I can see that. Think about the conditioning, right? From the time we're kids, leadership is reinforced positively. Yeah. You're popular, you're the one in charge, you get the credit.
It's always about the reward, the status, the visibility.
Right. But followership, it often carries these deeply uh, degrading connotations. When we talk about a follower, we traditionally imagine someone who maybe lacks imagination or is always reliant on the leader. That's what the research points to. And this negative picture actively undermines anyone wanting to identify with it. We're sort of socially conditioned to reject the word before we even understand the role properly.
So to solve this, we really need a complete overhaul in our approach. The first big shift needed is moving away from this idea that following is some fixed, stable personality type. That's just not accurate. We have to embrace followership as a dynamic identity, just like recent identity research suggests for all our roles. Our identities are multiple, they're constantly changing, heavily influenced by the environment, by the context we're in.
Okay, that's critical. Because if we stop trying to define the follower as some permanent personality trait, then we can focus entirely on the desirable, positive behaviors that effective followers bring to the table. The behaviors that the leader-centric literature just rarely, if ever, acknowledges.
Precisely. We need to completely redefine the narrative of what an effective follower actually is. They aren't just passive order takers, not at all. They are independent, critical thinkers. They often have to think outside the box to solve problems for the leader. That's a concept Kelly championed way back in the 80s.
That's interesting because traditionally we only credit the leader with being the innovator, the problem solver.
Exactly. But let's push that further. This role, this follower role, it also demands real courage. An effective follower is courageous enough to discreetly disagree or even, and this is a key phrase, intelligently disobey the leader if it's necessary.
Wait, hang on. Intelligent disobedience, that sounds pretty radical. What does that actually look like in practice? Is that just being difficult?
No, not at all. It's not about being difficult for its own sake. It means challenging a decision or the vision, maybe pushing back a bit. But not out of insubordination, not out of ego. It's because you care deeply about the mission, the goal, and you see a potential flaw or a danger that the person in charge might have missed. Chalef, who's written a lot about this, argues this isn't rebellion. It's actually about caring more about the successful outcome than just blindly following the hierarchy. These courageous followers, they actually make their leaders safer and ultimately better.
That's an incredible insight. Wow. And it brings us perfectly to our second major shift, I think. If we agree that following isn't a personality, but it's a set of dynamic behaviors, that helps us dismantle that older, more rigid model. That stable identity assumption, the idea that followership is fixed, it seems to stem from the notion that it's person-based. Kind of like how the outdated great man theory view leadership as purely based on disposition.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. The old idea that you're either born a leader or you're born a follower, which we know isn't true.
Right. But our sources strongly recommend that we approach both followership and leadership from a role perspective. Think of them like different hats we wear depending on the situation. Adopting this role perspective, it instantly frees us from needing one single stable identity label.
And that flexibility allows us to actually reflect organizational reality much better because organizations don't run on stable identities. They run on people switching roles constantly.
Okay, the perfect example, and it was mentioned in our reading, is the middle-level manager. Just think about your average work week. That manager is simultaneously a leader, maybe delegating tasks to their direct reports. And then, maybe an hour later, they're a follower, reporting up to their own superior about a project deadline or some results. They are constantly cycling between those two roles. That fluidity is absolutely key to how modern organizations actually function.
And thinking about followership as a role, well, it implies that individuals need the right behaviors to function effectively in that role, which means followership can and arguably must be learned and developed. And this directly addresses that critique we mentioned earlier, the one that says followership research is just replication of effort.
Which, is a fair question to ask,
hmm
because many of those effective followership variables like communication, building trust, showing courage, they look exactly like what we study in leadership development programs. Are we just studying the same thing twice here?
Not at all. Not if you look closely. The critical distinction, the key here, is that we cannot treat followership as the single unitary concept. We absolutely must recognize that just as there's good and bad leadership, there is good or effective and bad or ineffective followership. The whole purpose of this research field is to identify and understand the effective side of that equation.
Right. And there's a pretty strong argument being made in the sources that effective followership is actually foundational. Wait, so are they saying every effective leader must have been an effective follower first? Isn't that a bit of a chicken and egg situation, or is the research really that decisive on this?
The research leans very heavily towards decisiveness on that point. There's that great quote from one scholar, "He who must be a leader must first be a follower," unquote. And there's evidence supporting this. Studies of middle managers found that their exemplary leadership behaviors were positively related to their effective followership behaviors. Now, okay, correlation doesn't strictly prove causation, we know that. But it strongly suggests that the skill sets are deeply intertwined. Mastering the follower role likely influences how you develop as a leader.
That's a really powerful connection. Okay, so if the essential skills, things like courage, communication, building trust, if they overlap significantly between the two roles, what actually distinguishes the leader role from the follower role in practice? It surely can't just be the job title.
No, absolutely not the title. It's about the saliency. Or, the relative importance placed on those behaviors within the context of that specific role. And this is where the research gets incredibly useful because it actually asks people, okay, when you're in this role, what matters most?
Okay, interesting. And what did they find? What stood out?
Well, one comprehensive study on this found something quite striking. Out of a list of 20 important behaviors, only 5 were ranked similarly in importance by both leaders and followers, which means the vast majority of necessary traits had a different weight, a different priority, depending on which hat you were wearing at the time.
Only 5. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, I was assuming the roles were mostly different, but if only 5 behaviors, I think they were honesty, broad-mindedness, straightforwardness, being determined and independent. If only those overlap strongly in importance. It really means the context, the role itself, truly defines the job priorities. Okay, so what stands out as being most salient, most important for the followership role specifically?
Right. When you asked followers, what makes you effective in your role as a follower? The top traits that came up consistently were things like supportiveness, dependability, cooperativeness, and loyalty. These are the characteristics that followers themselves prioritize when they define success in their function. They seem to prioritize behaviors that uphold the relationship and help achieve the shared objective.
Okay, now this is where we hit that natural tension again, isn't it? because some follower-centric scholars, or maybe just modern workplace thinkers, might look at those top salient behaviors, especially loyalty and supportiveness, and immediately label them as, well, subservient,
Mm.
or argue they represent some kind of elitist rhetoric that we should be trying to get rid of in modern, flatter organizations.
Yeah, and that tension, it really needs to be challenged head on because, frankly, it ignores organizational reality. Look, if you're part of an organization working towards a common goal, you do pursue your leader's vision, at least partially. That's how collective work gets done. And achieving that shared vision is ultimately how followers achieve their own professional goals, too. We can't just pretend that power dynamics and hierarchy don't exist in organizational life simply because we wish they didn't. We need to identify the important follower behaviors that reflect reality, not wishful thinking devoid of it.
Okay, so we've argued for the legitimacy of the field. We've redefined the identity as dynamic, not fixed. And we've isolated some of the key behaviors of effective followership, noting their specific importance or saliency. That brings us naturally to the implications for, say, education or development.
Hmm.
Given that identity crisis we talked about, that most people still resist the label follower, it does seem like launching a standalone followership program is probably too ambitious right now, maybe too much too soon.
Exactly. You'd be starting a program for an identity that people are still actively or at least subconsciously resisting claiming. Our sources basically call that aspirational, but likely impractical for the time being.
Right. Therefore, the prescribed solution, the more practical approach, seems to be to infuse followership curriculum directly into existing leadership development programs. So, take established followership models, like those from Talef focusing on courage or Kelly on critical thinking, and integrate those concepts into the standard topics already being taught to aspiring leaders.
Yeah, the ultimate goal there is really twofold. First, you're teaching future leaders that, hey, they don't always have all the answers. They need to rely on their followers' expertise and critical thinking. And second, you're equipping those same future leaders with the skills and, maybe more importantly, the mindset to effectively step back and assume the follower role themselves when the situation calls for it.
And then, to really solidify that role-based approach, the final practical recommendation is pretty bold. Stop offering separate leadership or followership certificates. Instead, offer a joint effective leader-follower certificate.
Mm-hmm. This approach completely normalizes the learning of both sets of crucial behaviors side by side. It teaches individuals to see both leadership and followership as fluid, necessary roles, not fixed identities. And it equips them with the full behavioral toolkit needed to switch between those roles effectively, making them much more valuable organizational assets.
So what does this all mean? Where does this leave us?
Well, I think we've successfully argued for the legitimacy of followership as a field of study, mainly by challenging that old notion of a stable, maybe subservient follower identity. We've shifted the understanding of a follower from a static, perhaps reluctant personality type to a dynamic, critical role defined by important behaviors like courage, supportiveness, and dependability. And as the research clearly shows, since followership happens in the exact same organizational space as leadership, exploring one is inherently exploring the other. They're completely inseparable, two sides of the same coin. We've managed, I think, to define the core characteristics that really distinguish the effective follower role from the effective leader role, even when the skills overlap.
Okay, that's our wrap-up for this deep dive. And since the research strongly suggests that developing effective followership behaviors is positively related to becoming an effective leader down the line, here is a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Of those really salient follower behaviors we discussed today, things like intelligent disobedience or maybe supportiveness or perhaps dependability, which specific one should you focus on developing right now consciously to make yourself a better potential leader later on? Something to chew on.